Hi there, my name is Dr. Dave Pratt, and I'm here to help you, just like I've helped hundreds of people successfully pass the EdTPA. Here are the top 10 tips, starting with number 1. Put this assessment in perspective. This is not an evil conglomerate that is looking to get you. It's not Pearson trying to make a bunch of money off of you or your school or the state. This assessment was actually created by teachers and is owned by Stanford University. I don't know if you knew that, but this was developed by teachers and is assessed by teachers that have taught in the classroom. And they just want to know if you're an effective teacher. In fact, the PA in EdTPA, it stands for performance assessment, because it's just taking documents, it's taking artifacts, it's brilliant. It's saying they thought about how should we assess teachers? Let's use materials that teachers use to teach, like their lesson plans, and let's watch a recording of them teach. Let's look at their assessments and the feedback that they give their students in those assessments. That's what this is. The other problem people make is that they make EdTPA to be bigger than it is. This is just a series of 3 or 4 or 5 lessons on a specific topic. It's a unit of lessons. And you don't even have to submit like a recording of every lesson. It's just snippets of these 3 or 4 or 5 lessons that you're building artifacts to submit just to get approval, certification, verification that you're effective at what you do. It's using the same standards for your grade level and subject that you're already teaching. It's using the same curriculum you're already going to be teaching. Don't make it bigger than it is. Put it in perspective. Number 2, focus on effective teaching. There's nothing more important than you just planning your lessons, thinking about what is effective for me to do as a teacher for my students. How can I help them learn? It's about student learning. And in these artifacts, even though there's some hoops you have to jump through with the terminology, like instead of a unit of lessons, it's called a segment, lesson segment. There's this thing called academic language. We'll get to that later. And there's these reflections that you have to make on your teaching. They're called commentaries. I mean, there's some things you have to learn, this new language that they're talking about. You have to kind of unpack that a little bit. You have to jump through hoop, but it's mainly about the things you do as a good teacher. There's 3 parts: how you plan for your teaching, how you teach, and artifacts related to assessment. Plan, instruct, assess. That's all they're looking for, are documents related to those 3 components. So focus on good teaching in those 3 areas. You'll be fine. Top tip number 3. It's to review very carefully 3 essential documents. The first being your handbook for your EdTPA subject matter. The handbook is your Bible. It's a Bible because my dad always said, if you're a good Christian, your Bible should be worn out. You should know it in and out. Every time you look at it, you kind of find something new, but you're constantly searching for what it means. And there's a lot to unpack in that handbook, but it's so essential. You focus your time and energy on understanding the handbook, which has not only a step-by-step directions, but it has rubrics, the rubrics that they use to assess you, and an evidence guide that gives you specifications on what format to submit your materials in, what font size, the maximum amount of pages. Really pay attention to your handbook. But there's two other documents I want to point out that are very important for you to consider. One of those is making good choices. It walks you through the choices you should be making. So why don't you look at that before you plan, instruct, and assess? Look through the making good choices through each of those stages, in addition to one final document. Kind of check this at the end to make sure before you teach and assess rubric level progressions. Because when you look at the handbook and you look at the rubrics on what you're being assessed on, there's 15 areas in most cases. Sometimes it's hard to interpret the rubrics on their own in the handbook. So that's why that document called Understanding Rubric Level Progressions walks you through the language of the rubric. That could be a huge help. Those three documents is the third tip. Tip number 4, check the evidence chart carefully before you submit to Pearson. I said Pearson doesn't own it. That's true, but they do manage it because it's so big. It's used across the whole country now in hundreds of universities. They aren't joking. They aren't playing. I have a student every semester. I have somebody submit EdTPA and they don't believe it. They don't believe me to check the evidence chart. And they submit a video that's too big. The file size is too big or too long, or it's edited. And I mean, you use your phone to record a couple of, segments of your teaching. And most likely, I mean, you could use whatever, but you can't edit. It has to be a continuous view of your teaching. It's not like your best hits or anything. And what they did is they knew they couldn't stop it and start again, but they did want to change the angle. And so they just hit pause and then they moved it over to a different spot in the class and continued it. They were not able to be scored. They got rejected. There was no score given. You know why? Because it was stopped. It has to be continuous flow. It would have been better. They could have taken the camera and moved it. But you don't know. You don't know if they hit pause and said, shut up, class. We're all staying in for recess unless you're good. And then started it again. So please follow the direction carefully. Don't go over the page limits. Make sure the font size is right. There's an evidence guide you must check. The next point is, please don't panic over this thing called language demands. The thing that trips people up the most on EdTPA is language demands. What does that mean? Part of keeping it in perspective, there's 15 rubrics usually for most of your EdTPAs, 15 criteria. They're looking for 15 things, 5 for planning, 5 for instruction, 5 for assessment. Two rubrics deal specifically with language. I know there's 2 that you have to care about. But when you look at academic language, you start to think maybe this makes sense because you have to use language to teach. Language, learning doesn't happen without language, okay? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is with language demands, really focus on language function and vocabulary. You could still get a perfectly decent score and pass this thing if you just understand demands and vocabulary. We already know vocabulary. It's whatever vocabulary you need to help the students learn to understand that topic that you're teaching. Usually curriculum guides have lists of vocabulary words. It's this language demands that trips and freaks people out. I mean, the language function. Language function simply means the verb in your objective that you're teaching. Look at your objectives. There's usually a verb like summarize, analyze. There's something you're asking your students to do, and it's a verb. That's your language function. And it needs to be clearly described, defined, and unpacked for the students to really understand and appreciate what you're asking them to do. So language function is the verb in what you're asking them to do. And vocabulary is the new vocabulary that they need to know to learn what you're expecting them to learn. All right, we're halfway through. Stay with me. And the next part is about assessment, which really confuses people. They're like, how many assessments do I have to have? And it says there has to be a variety. What does that mean? Here's a big tip and helpful hint for you regarding assessment. What you have to remember is assessments are any activities that help you find out what students know. This means anytime you're asking them to do something, you could use as an assessment. Almost all the activities that you do can be some form of assessment. Mostly you think of assessment as a big test or something at the end. Well, it could be that, but it also could be the checks for understanding along the way, like an exit slip, for example, at the end of your first lesson. That's a perfectly fine form of assessment. It could be informal or formal. It could be checks for understanding like thumbs up, thumbs down, or fist of five, help, a self-assessment of how much they learned. Just embed these throughout your lessons. You want to know if they're learning or not. Again, EdTPA is about good teaching and about student learning. Make sure you're checking in multiple times. There is a more formal, you have to have at least one at the end for part 3 assessment, where you're analyzing a whole class set of data, all of your students on at least one of the assessments, to analyze the data and reflect on your teaching, unless you're special ed and you're just doing that with one student. But assessment is really important, and actually it's one of the weakest areas. When you look at the data of the national data on EdTPA, task 3 or part 3 assessment is the lowest scoring area. It's because people don't have a good understanding of what assessment is, especially those formative checks for understanding. And they don't give good, decent feedback. And feedback needs to be something that they did well, related to the standard, something that they could improve on related to that standard, and connecting it to a strategy or something that they learned before to help them grow in their learning. All right, number 7. You really have to focus on the right thing in your video. And by the way, for videos, I encourage you to record all of your lessons. You'll have a ton of recording to choose from. But that makes it a little bit easier to find the continuous parts that you could select to send in that emphasize specific things. Look at the rubrics for what they're looking for, the reviewers are looking for in your video samples. These are things like, I think rubric 6 for almost everybody is respect, rapport. How are you building rapport with your students? This could be both verbal and non-verbal ways. The way that you make sure you're looking in their eyes and active listening, maybe repeating what they said, smiling, gesturing, fluctuating your voice. I mean, there's a million ways you could show respect and rapport with your students. You calling them by their names. So just be using a lot of examples of that throughout your lessons, as I'm sure you do. And then select the lessons where you could highlight certain areas where you're showing rapport and respect to your students. Another thing they look for, the next rubric, is expanding or pressing them to think in deeper ways. So make sure when you're asking questions, constantly ask them to explain more. What do you mean by that? Have you considered this? Or can somebody provide an alternative perspective? Or what do you agree or disagree with? Push to make sure you have some higher level of questions in your lessons, especially the ones where you pick to submit. One of the rubrics is about teaching content and modeling content. So kind of presenting content and modeling, but another rubric is interacting. So make sure one of at least one of your sample videos is you interacting and giving feedback to students, kind of working with them to understand the content. All right, we are up to number 8. Number 8 is paying attention to the rubric more than the artifacts. Don't get hung up on the 10 things you have to submit and making sure your context for learning is perfect. I mean, it has to be formatted correctly with the right font size, but people get hung up too much on making sure their artifact, like the lesson plan, is perfectly written in the right format. There's no format for the lesson plan. There's certain things they expect, but they don't grade your lesson plan. There's not a rubric that says, oh, their lesson plan was really well laid out. Just make sure in your lesson plan you have your standards, you have your objectives very clearly laid out, and that you have the activities and the assessments related to those, and have a step-by-step. It needs to be like a sub could teach it. It needs to be a breakdown of how this lesson goes. But the key is looking at the rubrics before you submit. Don't worry so much about each. It's confusing because through all of school, you usually turn in something and you get a score for that artifact, for that thing, that submission. It's not like that. As a reviewer, they train these teachers, these reviewers, to focus on the 3 language. What I mean by that, in each rubric, there's 5 levels of performance. The reviewer looks at the 3 first, and you should too. Look at the rubric, language number 3, at the 3 score of 3. That's hard for you. You want to do perfect. Don't look at the 5 yet. Look at the 3, just like the reviewer will. And then think about what artifacts meet that criteria, because that's what the reviewer does. So make sure you look at the artifacts now. Oh, where can I find that? So for planning rubric 1, it's like, how do you develop consecutive lessons on a common theme with the related skills. So look at the 3, think, okay, I have that in my lessons. I have that in my commentary for planning. So planning, there's 5 things they look for. So look in your planning artifacts, make sure you can find those. Instruction, same thing. Look at the 3, make sure you have those in your video. And in your commentary, you're describing those things specifically. You're pointing them out. Same thing with assessment. Oh, that's good. So pay attention to rubric. Then make sure you find that in your artifacts. Guess what? The number 1 artifact is your commentaries. There's a planning commentary where you explain everything. There's an instruction commentary, you explain everything. It's like a reflection, but it's specific prompts they ask. You know why they ask those prompts? Because that's what the rubrics are looking for. Assessment, there's a commentary. So look at the language in the rubric for 3. Go to your commentary. That is key to passing EdTPA. That's the ninth tip. Commentaries are key. Just make sure you address all parts of the commentary. It might seem repetitive, especially after you write out your lessons, but just make sure you're answering all questions. And here's another bonus tip. For commentaries, there's a maximum amount of pages. Students get into trouble when they don't pass. I say, okay, it's mainly about the commentary. So, I can't give you too much feedback, but how long were your commentaries? The max was 9 pages. I had 4, Brad. 4? I would go back and maybe explain a little bit in more detail how you're meeting those, because you don't have to max out. You don't have to have 9 single space pages if it's 9 max, but have at least 7, 8. That's more likely that you're answering fully or completely what they're asking for. If you have less than half, it's probably not enough explaining on what they're asking for in the rubrics. And the final, oh, this is the final tip. Please, please maintain a healthy balance of life and getting this assessment done and your work as a teacher. This is a very stressful time for you. This, on top of your teaching responsibilities, this additional work just to write out these lengthier lesson plans than you're used to, doing those commentaries that you don't normally do as a teacher adds additional stress, along with the higher stakes aspect of this. So please make sure you get, lots of rest, you eat well, you stay healthy, because the most important thing is the impact you're having on your students' lives. So this is just an assessment that is one more way to show that you're an effective teacher and you care about your students' learning. So thank you for watching. Please, if you like what I shared with you, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and I'd love to hear your comments below about any tips you have for passing EdTPA. Thanks again for watching. Take care.